Todos me dicen el negro llorona, negro pero cariñoso. Todos me dicen el negro llorona, negro pero cariñoso. Yo soy como el chile verde llorona, picante pero sabroso. Yo soy como el chile verde llorona, picante pero sabroso. Ay, de mi llorona, llorona de ayer y hoy.
Mexico is one of the most underrated countries in the world. North Americans hold a lot of preconceived notions about Mexico. When a friend mentions that they plan to visit Mexico, the reaction is usually negative. Don't go there. It's too violent. The drug lords, the cartels. Many Americans imagine that once you step over our southern border, you are in mortal danger. The media often describes drug lords killing thousands of people and dumping their bodies in all parts of the country. Some places in Mexico, especially the states near the border, are unsafe. In these places, dangerous drug lords earn enormous profits selling their wares to U.S. consumers. But most of Mexico is safe. Safer, in fact, than many areas of the United States. 16 states of the 32 in Mexico are very safe. Among these are Mexico City, Baja California, Chiapas, Oaxaca, Quintana Roo, Veracruz, and the Yucatan. So there is no reason to avoid going to Mexico. It is, of course, advisable to stay away from the dangerous places, just as you would in any country in the world. But Mexico is an amazingly beautiful country, filled with the wealth of an over 4,000-year history, sprinkled with the ruins of ancient cities, temples, and pyramids dating back to long before Columbus set foot in the New World, a dazzling natural environment, elegant cities, graceful 16th and 17th century colonial towns, a capital city that has more museums, over 150, than any other city in the world, and a kind, generous, profoundly gracious population. In pre-Columbian days, the native population inhabited all of what is now Mexico and beyond. Some lived in the southwestern United States, and others pushed into Guatemala and Central America. There were 7 major cultures: the Olmecs, the Teotihuacans, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, the Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, and the Maya. They traded with one another, learned one another's habits and customs, and generally influenced one another. The artifacts, art, and buildings of all of these different groups often strongly resembled each other. Unlike the native populations of North America, whose dwellings were impermanent, Mexicans built strong stone structures, many of which have withstood fire, flood, earthquakes, looting, and conquistadors, and have lasted in stunningly good condition until today. The remains of pre-Columbian big cities and solitary temples dot the landscape everywhere in Mexico. Mexico City itself was built in the center of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. This city was a marvel of lakes, causeways, and bridges, such that the Spanish conquerors were amazed by its elegance. Tenochtitlan was founded around 1325 and built on an island in a shallow, brackish lake called Mexcoco. Huitzilopochtli, their god, told the ancient Mexicoli people where to build their empire. He said that in their travels they would come upon an eagle on a nopal cactus with a snake in his mouth. In this spot they should build their city. The center of present-day Mexico City was that spot. The eagle, the snake, and the cactus form the symbol of Mexico and are depicted in the center of the Mexican flag. This was not the most promising site on which to build a city and an empire, but by 1521, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population of 250,000. Its buildings, which were made of stones and bridges and causeways, connected it to the mainland. There were canals which allowed canoes and other boats to maneuver. Surrounding the causeway were artificial floating gardens made of wooden rafts with mud placed on the top where crops were grown. As one of the rafts decayed, another was placed on top, and this process was repeated over time until the island became permanent. The crops grown in this way were an important part of the Aztec economy. Today, the canals are filled with brightly colored boats, which tourists hire to glide through the artificial islands. It is an exhilarating experience when the mariachi bands approach in another boat to play for the tourists. They dress traditionally in suits of black cloth with bright silver buttons and wear huge sombreros. With them are their guitars, their guitarons, their vihuelas, their violins, their trumpets, and their repertoire of traditional music which they play passionately as the tourists drift peacefully along the water.
De la Sierra Morena, cielito lindo, vienen bajando. Un par de ojitos negros, cielito lindo, de contrabando. De la Sierra Morena.
In addition, other vendors float alongside, selling corn on the cob with a choice of many toppings, cheese, lime, chili, or cilantro, to name a few. The tourists may not appreciate or know that UNESCO protects this music as part of Mexico's intangible cultural heritage, and that the canals are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In 1568, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a conquistador, in his book The Conquest of New Spain, wrote, "When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments, on account of the great towers and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. I do not know how to describe it, seeing things as we did that had never been heard of or seen before, not even dreamed about." In Mexico City in the 1980s, a major push occurred to find the temple that was at the heart of the Aztec Empire. To do this, the city fathers demolished 13 buildings in the city's center. But the payoff was great. Not only did they find the main temple of the city of Tenochtitlan, called Templo Mayor, but over 7,000 artifacts as well. The remains of this ancient Aztec complex stand right in the heart of the big modern capital of Mexico. Scientists are still excavating. Every few years, archaeologists make another exciting discovery. In 2017, they found a tower 6 meters in diameter, made of 650 human skulls. And as short a time ago as 2017, a sacrificial burial site was unearthed. And still they dig to find the infinite number of ancient artifacts, temples, palaces, and cities left by the ancestors of modern Mexico. In Mexico today, there are at least 40 major sites of ruins, but there are many minor sites as well. Tulum, a lovely complex by the sea, is a great tourist attraction. But Temple Ixchel, a very small ruin on Isla Mujeres, is an even more beautiful setting at Punta Sur, at the very end of the island. The temple is extremely small and modest, but the view from Punta Sur is nothing short of breathtaking. The ruins around Mexico have much in common with one another. There are big central plazas, mostly pyramidal-shaped temples, large staircases, and ball courts where ancient athletes played. This game was highly popular and played often just for fun. But sometimes the stakes for these games were high. It could cost the players their lives. Often this had to do with one group at war with another. After the battle, both sides would play ball, and the losers would be killed. But sometimes, when sacrifice to the gods was glorified, the winners would be killed. At all times, it was better to play just for fun. The architecture of Mexico changed radically with the advent of the Spanish. Although many Europeans admired the architectural creations of the native people, they did not hesitate to destroy the cities and replace them with their own. In 1524, the Spanish explorer Hernán Cortés described Tenochtitlan, present-day Mexico City, in a letter to Charles V, King of Spain. There are in the city many large and beautiful houses. All these houses have very large and very good rooms, and also very pleasant gardens of various sorts of flowers, both on the upper and lower floors. These people live almost like those in Spain, and in as much harmony and order as there. And considering that they are barbarous, and so far from the knowledge of God, and cut off from all civilized nations, it is truly remarkable to see what they have achieved in all things. First, there were the conquistadors, the conquerors who took over the lands of the native people of Mexico. They were soon followed by the Roman Catholic religious orders, who found around 25 million souls to save. That number, however, continued to decrease as the native culture was decimated. The natives were forced to provide hard labor and were exposed to European diseases for which they had no immunity. By the end of the 16th century, the population had fallen drastically, and as few as 1 million indigenous people had survived. The Spanish priests, in their zeal to convert the natives, moved from town to town. They often tore apart the indigenous temples and replaced them with Christian churches from the native buildings that they had destroyed. The priests had no building skills. They employed Spanish architects, but used native craftsmen to erect the buildings. These natives lent an ornate quality to both the facades and the interiors by using images of native elements such as fruits and shells. In beauty, these churches surpassed those of the proposed plain Baroque ones. By 1559, over 800 missionaries had arrived in Mexico, and by 1600, over 400 monasteries had been built. The missionaries baptized the people as quickly as they could. For the natives, Christianity was partly a veneer. They did not shed their old religion, but formed a new syncretic one. that combined their ancient forms of worship with the Christianity taught by their overlords. In Mexico City, right on top of the site of the Aztec sacred precinct, the Europeans built the Metropolitan Cathedral, presently the largest cathedral in all of Latin America. Construction began in 1573 and lasted until 1813. Many styles of architecture were used in the approximately 250 years as tastes and styles changed. It is said that Hernan Cortes, the famous conquistador, laid its first stone. Many of the cities and towns of Mexico date back to the 16th century and have managed, even through the ravages of time, to maintain their original charm and beauty. Mérida, the capital of the Yucatan, is a very unique example. Founded on the Mayan city of To in 1542, Mérida was constructed with the building materials and carved stones of the Mayas. These stones are still visible in the walls of Ildefonsa, the large cathedral in the heart of Mérida today. What distinguishes Mérida from other colonial cities is its long, elegant avenue modeled on those in Paris. In the 19th and early 20th century, Mérida produced agave, whose fibers were turned into rope. At that time, it was worth its weight in gold. And agave production made more millionaires than in any other city in the world. Unfortunately for Mérida, artificial rope began to be produced, and the agave market collapsed. The mansions remained even after its inhabitants abandoned them to search for job opportunities elsewhere. Many were turned into public buildings, museums, and banks. But others are boutique hotels and Airbnbs. Today, for very little money, a tourist can stay in an old mansion and become a king or a queen for a day. Mexico is filled with small, charming towns whose antique, multicolored buildings, cobbled, narrow streets, and lively public squares are filled with movement, music, and laughter. Life in these towns is slow and personal. Lovers have time to express their adoration for one another. Parents have time to stroll lazily with their infants toward the busy central squares. The whole town turns out daily for music or dancing in the Zócalo. The tourist board calls them pueblos mágicos, magic towns. In these wonderful places, we are taken on a carpet ride to a soft and intimate past. These towns are not necessarily well known, although they can be, but have special cultural significance, either through their lovely locations, their historical connections, or their cultural wealth. For example, Tulum, a pueblo mágico, is a popular destination for tourists because of its extraordinary ruins adjacent to the sea. Mazunte is not well known, but it is a pueblo mágico because the Mexican Turtle Center there grows and protects turtles, finally releasing the babies to the sea. Oaxaca is too large to qualify for the designation of Magic Town. More importantly, though, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Here, the city erects banks of chairs each evening in the Plaza de la Constitución, the central square, where musicians arrive to entertain the people. Very much off the beaten path, Oaxaca is very different from cosmopolitan Mexico City. It has the largest indigenous population of any city in Mexico, amounting to 18% of its inhabitants. Oaxaca dwells in the past. It was founded in 1529 in a small valley occupied by rural Zapotecs, whose culture dated back thousands of years. Today, there are no skyscrapers, no noisy construction, no rushing around to keep appointments. Just a slow stroll up the walking street, Andrador de Macedonia Acala, to the church of Santo Domingo. In the faces of the indigenous inhabitants is the history of many generations. Andrador de Macedonia Acala is a street that personifies the beauty of Oaxaca. You just cannot hurry here, because along this route are shops full of beautiful objects. Brightly colored art, paintings, well-designed crafts, the odors of some of the best food in Mexico, elegant cafes, and the graceful beauty of the Church of Santo Domingo. The Church of Santo Domingo is old. Its construction was begun in 1575 and lasted 200 years. Its interior is awe-inspiring, with over 60,000 sheets of gold covering its walls. Adjacent to the church is its monastery, which has been converted into a regional museum. The space in this building is very beautiful but highly complex, filled with long hallways, auxiliary rooms, courtyards, and cloisters. From its large open windows, over 100 species of plants indigenous to Oaxaca are visible in the adjacent ethnobotanical gardens. Many of the museum's displays are artifacts discovered at the nearby UNESCO World Heritage Site, Monte Alban. It was one of the earliest, largest, and most important cities of Mesoamerica. It was founded around 500 BC. Monte Alban was occupied by a succession of people, the Olmecs, the Zapotecs, and the Mixtecs. Out of the mountains, these people carved pyramids, sacred mounds, dams, canals, staircases, athletic fields, and terraces. In 850 A.D., Monte Alban was abandoned. The mystery of why its people left has yet to be solved. Art is very central to Mexican culture. The ancient people bestowed on future generations not only the ruins of great temples, pyramids, and large cities, but many of the objects that filled them as well. Many Mexican cities have anthropological museums, where ancient statues, carvings, reliefs, replicas, and ceramics are displayed. The National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City exhibits an overwhelming number of such exquisite objects. Present-day Mexicans flock there on weekends when it is free and encounter the wonders that their ancestors created. Mexicans are aware of their resplendent past and take great pride in it. The Spanish admired the abilities of the local inhabitants to create such magnificent cities and temples. But that did not stop them from capturing and enslaving the natives, and making them surrender their gods to the dark shadows of history. The native people lost their way. They left behind the glories of their previous culture. They were brainwashed into believing that the Spaniards were superior.
ya se fue.